I stared at the bankruptcy notice in my trembling hands as my stepmother's shrill laughter echoed through the marble foyer of what used to be my father's mansion. Well, 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 Victoria sneered, her perfectly manicured nails clicking against her wineglass. Looks like Daddy's little princess is finally getting what she deserves. My half-sister Melody giggled from her perch on the Italian leather sofa, not bothering to look up from her phone. I told you that art degree was worthless, Sophia. Maybe now you'll stop pretending you're better than us. The papers crinkled as my grip tightened. Chen Industries, the small tech startup I'd poured my inheritance into, was officially dead. My last dollar, gone. Everything I had left of my real mother's memory, squandered on what everyone called a pipe dream. But as I stood there, listening to their cruel celebration of my apparent failure, something stirred deep in my chest. A familiar warmth, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. I remembered this exact moment from before. The memory hit me like a freight train. My previous life, my death at 28, from the stress-induced heart attack brought on by years of their psychological torture, and most importantly, what happened next. Chen Industries didn't fail. It became the largest AI company in the world, worth over $50 billion. And in 3 days, James Chen would announce the breakthrough that would change everything. But this time, I owned 49% of it. You're right, I said quietly, folding the notice and slipping it into my purse. I should have listened to you all along. Victoria's eyes lit up with malicious satisfaction. Finally, some sense from the charity case. Your father was too soft leaving you that trust fund. At least now we can stop pretending you belong in this family. The charity case. That's what she'd called me since the day she married my father when I was 12, 6 months after my mother died in the car accident. Victoria came complete with her own daughter, Melody, who was everything I wasn't. Blonde, bubbly, and cruel, in the casual way that only comes from a lifetime of privilege. My father, grief-stricken and vulnerable, fell completely under Victoria's spell. Within a year, I'd gone from beloved daughter to unwanted burden. They moved me to the smallest bedroom in the house, enrolled me in public school while Melody attended private academy, and made it clear at every family gathering that I was an outsider looking in. Remember your sweet 16? Victoria continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. When we forgot to invite your friends because we thought you'd prefer a quiet family dinner? And Melody got that beautiful diamond necklace while you got... She paused dramatically. What was it again? Oh yes, a gift card to the bookstore. Melody finally looked up from her phone. God, you were so pathetic, crying over some stupid books. At least now you'll have to get a real job instead of playing pretend investor. They had no idea that in my previous life, I'd worked 3 jobs while putting myself through business school after father cut off my education fund. No idea that I'd clawed my way up from nothing, building a small but successful consulting firm, only to die alone in my tiny apartment with no one to mourn me but a few colleagues. But this time would be different. This time, I had something I'd never possessed before. Knowledge of the future. I'd been reborn 3 years ago, the day after my 21st birthday, with every memory of my previous life intact. I'd woken up in this same house, in that same tiny bedroom, with Victoria knocking on my door to remind me that my play money trust fund had finally been released. Instead of the conservative investments everyone expected, I'd shock them all by putting everything into Chen Industries, a struggling AI startup run by a young MIT dropout that everyone said was doomed to fail. You'll lose everything, my father had warned, though his tone suggested he didn't really care. That boy is a dreamer, not a businessman. Let her learn the hard way, Victoria had said. Some people have to fail before they accept reality. But I knew something they didn't. I knew that James Chen wasn't just a dreamer. He was a visionary who would revolutionize artificial intelligence. I knew that his supposedly failed prototype was actually 3 breakthroughs ahead of anything Google or Microsoft had developed. And I knew that in exactly 3 days, he would announce the launch of Aria, an AI system so advanced it would make everything else obsolete overnight. More importantly, I knew that the mysterious major investor who swooped in at the last minute to save Chen Industries in my previous life was actually a shell company controlled by Melody's boyfriend, Marcus Webb, heir to the Webb family fortune. He'd bought up the shares cheap, ridden the company to success, and used the profits to propose to Melody with a $15 million ring that made headlines worldwide. This time, those shares were mine. Standing in that marble foyer, watching Victoria and Melody celebrate what they thought was my final humiliation, I made the conscious decision to stop being their victim. I had been given the ultimate gift, a second chance at life with the knowledge to change everything. And I was going to use every single advantage I had to make them pay for every cruel word, every dismissal, every moment they'd made me feel like I wasn't worthy of love. "You're absolutely right," I said again, my voice calm and steady. "I should focus on reality instead of dreams." Victoria raised her wine glass in a mock toast. To Sophia finally growing up. I smiled, a real smile that didn't reach my eyes. To getting exactly what we all deserve. They had no idea what was coming. The next morning, I stood outside the gleaming Chen Industries office building, my last $5 clutched in my sweaty palm. In my previous life, I'd only visited this place once, years later, as part of a consulting contract when it was already worth billions. Now, it looked exactly as rundown as I remembered from the old photos. Cracked windows, a flickering neon sign, and the distinct air of a company on its last legs. James Chen answered the door himself, looking exactly as young and desperate as I expected. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, his black hair was disheveled, and his MIT sweatshirt had seen better days. But behind his exhaustion, I could see the brilliant mind that would soon change the world. "Are you the investor?" he asked hopefully, glancing past me as if expecting to see someone more impressive. "I am," I said firmly. "I believe in what you're building here, James." His face fell slightly. "Look, I appreciate the interest, but I was expecting someone with more substantial backing. The bills are due tomorrow, and I need at least $50,000 just to keep the lights on." I pulled out my phone and showed him my investment portfolio. Every penny of my inheritance tied up in Chen Industries stock. I know it's not much now, but I'm all in. 49%, everything I have. James stared at the screen, then at me. "You put your entire inheritance into a failing AI startup? Are you insane?" "Maybe," I laughed, "but I'd rather bet everything on something I believe in than play it safe and watch from the sidelines." That's when I saw it, the spark of recognition in his eyes. Not because he remembered me, but because he saw something he desperately needed. Someone who actually believed in his vision. In my previous life, everyone had called him a dreamer, a dropout, a kid playing with computers. But I knew what he was really building in that cluttered laboratory. "Want to see what you're investing in?" he asked quietly. I followed him through the maze of servers and cables to a small room in the back. There, on a single monitor, was Aria in her earliest form. Lines of code that would soon become the most sophisticated AI system ever created. "She's not ready yet," James said, his voice soft with affection. "But she's learning. Every day she gets smarter, more intuitive. The other companies are building AI to follow commands, but Aria, she understands context. She can read between the lines, anticipate needs, even demonstrate creativity." I watched the screen, remembering the headlines from my previous life. Aria passes every Turing test. AI writes best-selling novel. Chen Industries stock soars 3,000%. But more than that, I remembered the deeper story, how Marcus Webb had swooped in at the last moment, buying up shares from desperate early investors for pennies on the dollar, then riding the wave to fortune. "Show me," I said. James's fingers flew over the keyboard. "Aria, we have a visitor. Can you introduce yourself?" The response came immediately. "Hello, Sophia. I've been analyzing your investment patterns and biographical data. You graduated summa cum laude with a degree in art history, but your portfolio shows sophisticated understanding of emerging technologies. You're either extremely lucky or you know something others don't." James's mouth fell open. She's never done that before, the biographical analysis, I mean. That's supposed to be a feature I'm still working on." I smiled, remembering from my previous life that Aria's spontaneous evolution was what eventually made her so valuable. "She's more advanced than you realize." "The funding meeting is in 2 days," James said, shutting down the system. Marcus Webb from Webb Industries is supposedly interested, but he wants to see a full demonstration first. If Aria performs the way I think she can, she will, I said with absolute certainty. But James, I need to ask you something. When the offers start coming in, promise me you won't sell out too cheap. This technology is worth more than anyone realizes. He looked at me strangely. How can you be so sure? Because, I said, meeting his eyes steadily, I've learned to recognize revolutionary potential when I see it. That night, I sat in my tiny bedroom, surrounded by the research I'd compiled about every major player in the AI industry. In my previous life, I'd been too naive, too trusting. I'd watched from the sidelines as smarter, more ruthless people seized opportunities I'd missed. But this time, I had advantages they couldn't imagine. I knew that Webb Industries was secretly hemorrhaging money from failed ventures. I knew that Marcus's father was putting pressure on him to produce results, or face having his trust fund revoked. I knew that the casual interest he'd shown in Chen Industries was actually desperate reconnaissance for what he hoped would be his salvation. Most importantly, I knew exactly how he planned to steal it. In my previous life, Marcus had attended the demonstration, seen Aria's potential, then immediately launched a whisper campaign about James's instability and lack of business experience. He'd spread rumors about the company's financial troubles, scared off other investors, then swooped in with a rescue offer that gave him controlling interest for a fraction of what the company was worth. But this time, I was going to be ready for him. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to every tech journalist I could remember from my previous life. Then, I started making calls to venture capital firms using every piece of insider knowledge I possessed to paint a picture of Chen Industries as the opportunity of the century. By dawn, I'd planted seeds that would bloom into a media frenzy. Articles about the AI revolution's unlikely pioneer and why smart money is betting on Chen Industries would start appearing within hours. Marcus Webb would walk into that demonstration expecting to find a desperate startup ripe for exploitation, only to discover he was bidding against some of the biggest names in tech. But the real masterstroke was still to come. I picked up my phone and dialed a number I'd memorized from my previous life, one that would change everything. "Hello, grandfather," I said when the familiar voice answered. "It's Sophia. I think it's time we finally met." The demonstration was set for Friday afternoon in Chen Industries' modest conference room. I arrived early, ostensibly to provide moral support for James, but really to watch Marcus Webb's face when he realized his carefully laid plans were about to crumble. Marcus looked exactly as I remembered from Melody's social media posts, tall, blonde, and radiating the kind of confident arrogance that came from never having to worry about money. He swept into the room like he owned it, flanked by 2 lawyers and an accountant, clearly expecting to intimidate a desperate young entrepreneur into accepting whatever lowball offer he presented. "James," he boomed, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Ready to change your life today?" James, to his credit, maintained his composure despite the obvious pressure tactics. "Ready to show you what Aria can do." That's when Marcus noticed me sitting quietly in the corner. "And you are?" "Sophia Chen," I said smoothly, using the surname I'd legally adopted the day before. Another advantage of knowing exactly when and how to prepare. "James's business partner and lead investor." Marcus's smile faltered slightly. "I wasn't aware there was a partner involved." 49% owner, I clarified pleasantly. "I believe in backing visionaries." The demonstration began, and Aria performed even better than I'd hoped. She solved complex problems in real time, engaged in philosophical discussions about the nature of consciousness, and even composed a haunting piece of music that brought tears to the eyes of one of Marcus's lawyers. "Incredible," Marcus breathed, his eyes lighting up with dollar signs. "James, I'm prepared to make you an offer right now, $5 million for 60% of the company." In my previous life, that offer would have seemed like salvation to a desperate young entrepreneur. But James had spent the last 2 days fielding calls from investors I'd tipped off, and his perspective had changed dramatically. "I appreciate the interest," James said carefully, "but I've received several competing offers. I think the fair market value might be somewhat higher." Marcus's confident smile disappeared entirely. "Competing offers?" That's when my grandfather walked through the door. Richard Chen was 83 years old, worth approximately $12 billion, dollars, and had built his fortune from nothing after immigrating from Taiwan in the 1960s. He was also the estranged father my mother had left behind when she married beneath her station. A brilliant, stubborn man who had spent the last 21 years wondering about the granddaughter he'd never been allowed to meet. In my previous life, I died never knowing he existed. Victoria had hidden every letter, every birthday card, every attempt he'd made to contact me after my mother's death. But this time, I'd reached out first. "Grandfather," I said, rising to embrace him, "thank you for coming." Marcus Webb went white as a sheet. Everyone in the tech industry knew Richard Chen by reputation, and his presence transformed this from a small startup negotiation into a major corporate event. "So this is the young man who's captured my granddaughter's attention," grandfather said, studying James with sharp eyes. "Show me this ARIA system I've heard so much about." What followed was the most thorough technical demonstration I'd ever witnessed. Grandfather peppered James with questions that revealed not only his deep understanding of the technology, but also his recognition of its revolutionary potential. Marcus's lawyers frantically whispered in his ear, clearly advising him to increase his offer, but it was too late. "James," grandfather said finally, "I'd like to propose a partnership. Chen Industries will receive a $50 million investment in exchange for 20% equity. My granddaughter maintains her 49%, you retain 31%, and we bring in proper management support to help you scale." Marcus looked like he'd been slapped. "Mr. Chen, with all due respect, I was here first. We had an understanding." "Did we?" James asked mildly. "Because I don't recall accepting any offers." I watched Marcus's face cycle through disbelief, anger, and finally desperate calculation. He was trapped, and he knew it. His father's ultimatum, the family's financial troubles, his promises to Melody about their future, all of it depended on landing this deal. "60 million for 30%, he said desperately. "Final offer." "75 million for 25%, came a new voice from the doorway. Sarah Kim, CEO of Nexus Ventures, strode into the room with the confidence of someone who'd built a $10 billion portfolio by recognizing genius before anyone else. I'd tipped her off about today's demonstration, knowing she'd never forgive herself for missing out on the next Google. "Make that 80 million for 20%, said another voice. David Park from Innovation Capital had arrived, followed by representatives from 3 more major VC firms. The small conference room was suddenly packed with some of the most powerful investors in Silicon Valley, all bidding against each other for a piece of what they now recognized as the opportunity of the decade. Marcus Webb sat frozen in his chair, watching his carefully planned corporate raid turn into a frenzied auction he couldn't possibly win. His $5 million offer now seemed not just inadequate, but almost insulting. "Ladies and gentlemen," grandfather said, raising his voice above the chaos, "perhaps we should let Mr. Chen and his partner discuss their options privately." As the room cleared, I caught Marcus's arm. "Walk with me," I said pleasantly. We stepped out into the hallway, away from the crowd of disappointed investors. Marcus's facade had finally cracked, revealing the desperate young man underneath. "You did this," he said quietly. "Somehow, you orchestrated all of this." "I recognized an opportunity and acted on it," I replied. "Isn't that what business is about?" "My family needs this," he said. And for the first time, I heard genuine desperation in his voice. "The Webb Trust is... we're not as stable as people think. This was supposed to be my chance to prove myself." I felt a flicker of something that might have been sympathy, quickly extinguished by the memory of all the times Melody had flaunted her relationship with him, all the expensive gifts purchased with money he'd expected to steal from James. "Maybe you should have thought of that before you planned to cheat a brilliant young entrepreneur out of his life's work," I said coolly. His face went pale. "How did you know about your plan to lowball James? About the Whisper campaign you were going to launch to scare off other investors?" I smiled. "Let's just say I'm very good at reading people." Marcus stared at me with growing horror. "Who are you?" "Someone who believes in justice," I said, "and someone who knows that actions have consequences." When we returned to the conference room, the deal was already done. Chen Industries had accepted grandfather's offer, $50 million for 20% equity, with James retaining operational control and me maintaining my position as the largest individual shareholder. Marcus sat in stunned silence as the lawyers finalized the paperwork. His dreams of corporate salvation, of impressing his father, of giving Melody the lifestyle she expected, all of it crumbling like a house of cards. "There will be other opportunities," I said gently as he gathered his things. He looked at me with hollow eyes. "Will there?" I thought about his father's ultimatum, about the Webb family's mounting debts, about Melody's expensive tastes and complete ignorance of their financial situation. In my previous life, this deal would have saved them. This time, their reckoning was just beginning. "That depends," I said, "on whether you've learned anything from today." As Marcus left, shoulders slumped in defeat, I felt the first real satisfaction I'd experienced since my rebirth. This was what justice felt like. Not the explosive revenge of movies, but the quiet satisfaction of seeing someone reap exactly what they'd sown. But this was only the beginning. The announcement of Chen Industries' funding sent shockwaves through the tech industry, and more importantly, through my family. I was having dinner at a small cafe near the office when my phone started buzzing with increasingly frantic calls from Victoria and Melody. I let them go to voicemail. 3 hours later, I walked into the mansion to find them both waiting in the living room, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. "Sophia," Victoria said carefully, "we saw the news about that little company of yours. Quite a surprise." Surprise. I set down my purse and looked at them with feigned innocence. "I thought you said I should focus on reality instead of dreams." Melody was scrolling frantically through her phone. "Marcus isn't answering my calls. He was supposed to close some big deal today, but—" "Oh, that deal fell through," I said casually. "I was there, actually." Poor Marcus seemed quite disappointed. The color drained from Melody's face. "You were there? Why were you—" She stopped, the pieces finally clicking into place. "You sabotaged him." "I invested in a promising company and protected my interests," I corrected, "though I suppose Marcus might see it differently." Victoria stood up slowly, her wineglass forgotten. "How much did you make from this investment?" I pretended to calculate in my head, though I knew the exact figures by heart. "Well, I invested my entire inheritance, about $3 million, for 49% of the company. After today's valuation, that stake is worth approximately $37 million. The wineglass slipped from Victoria's hand and shattered on the marble floor. $37 million? Melody whispered. "But that's impossible. You're supposed to be the failure. You're supposed to be—" "Nothing," I finished gently. "A charity case? The disappointment who could never measure up to your perfect daughter?" Victoria's mask was slipping, revealing the calculating woman underneath. "Sophia, darling, I think there's been some misunderstanding between us. You know how much your father and I care about you." "My father," I interrupted, "who hasn't spoken to me in 3 months, who didn't attend my college graduation, who told me I was financially cut off the day I turned 21. He was trying to teach you responsibility," Victoria said weakly. "And you?" I turned to Melody. "Were you teaching me responsibility when you told everyone at your engagement party that I was adopted? When you borrowed my car and returned it with the bumper hanging off? When you convinced Daddy to give your boyfriend the internship that was supposed to be mine?" Melody's face crumpled. "Marcus dumped me," she whispered, "right after the meeting. He said his family couldn't afford to associate with mine anymore and that it was all your fault." I felt a stab of genuine pity for her, quickly suppressed. "I'm sorry to hear that, but maybe it's for the best. After all, you wouldn't want to marry someone who's only interested in your money." "What money?" Victoria snapped, her composure finally breaking. "This house is mortgaged to the hilt. Your father's business is failing. We're barely keeping our heads above water, and you—" She stopped, realizing what she'd revealed. "I what?" I asked softly. "I could help? I could save the family that spent years making sure I knew I wasn't really part of it?" The room fell silent except for the sound of Melody's quiet sobbing. "Please," Victoria whispered, all her arrogance finally gone. "We made mistakes. We can change." I looked at them, really looked, and saw not the powerful figures who had dominated my childhood, but two desperate women who had built their identity on wealth and status they didn't actually possess. In my previous life, I would have caved immediately, desperate for any scrap of approval or affection. But I wasn't that person anymore. Change is possible, I said finally, but it has to come from within. I can't give you self-worth, and I won't be your financial safety net. You'll both need to figure out who you are when you're not defining yourselves in opposition to me. I walked toward the stairs, then paused. Oh, and Victoria, I'll be moving out next week. I've purchased a penthouse downtown. You'll have the house to yourselves for as long as you can afford to keep it. Behind me, I heard Victoria's sharp intake of breath and Melody's renewed sobbing. Part of me wanted to turn around, to comfort them, to play the role of rescuer they suddenly needed me to be. Instead, I climbed the stairs to my childhood bedroom one last time, already planning my new life. The next 18 months passed in a blur of controlled chaos and exponential growth. Aria's official launch exceeded even my optimistic projections, revolutionizing everything from medical diagnosis to creative writing. Chen Industries went public at a valuation of $15 billion, making me, at 23, one of the youngest female billionaires in history. But more satisfying than the money was watching my family's carefully constructed world crumble exactly as I'd predicted. Victoria had tried desperately to maintain their facade of wealth, throwing increasingly expensive parties and buying designer clothes they couldn't afford. When the credit cards were maxed out and the loans came due, she'd attempted to reconcile with me through a series of increasingly desperate letters and voicemails. Darling, I know we haven't always seen eye to eye, but family should stick together. Sophia, your father is so proud of your success. Perhaps we could discuss some investment opportunities. Please, we're facing some temporary difficulties. Surely you can spare just a little help for the people who raised you. I donated $10 million to charity in her name instead, making sure the press release mentioned that it was in honor of Victoria Martinez's dedication to teaching young women the value of self-reliance. Melody's downfall had been more dramatic. After Marcus dumped her, she'd gone through a series of increasingly desperate relationships with men she'd met on dating apps designed for wealthy singles. Each relationship ended when they discovered the truth about her family's finances. The Instagram influencer career she'd built on displays of luxury collapsed when she could no longer afford the lifestyle she'd been flaunting. She'd tried to reconnect with me too, showing up at my office building with tear-stained cheeks and designer handbags she was probably planning to return after our meeting. Sophia, we're sisters, she'd pleaded. Blood means something, doesn't it? We're not sisters, I'd replied gently but firmly. We're two people who happen to live in the same house for a few years. That's not the same thing as family. My father's reaction had been the most complex. Unlike Victoria and Melody, he'd never directly asked for money. Instead, he'd started showing up at industry events, introducing himself as Sophia Chen's father to anyone who would listen. The desperate pride in his voice was almost heartbreaking. My daughter, he'd tell reporters, always was a brilliant girl. I knew she'd make something of herself. The revisionist history might have angered me once. Now it just seemed pathetic. But tonight was different. Tonight was the annual Tech Innovation Awards, where I was receiving the Visionary Leadership Prize. The irony wasn't lost on me. In my previous life, I'd watched the ceremony on television from my tiny apartment, dreaming of someday being important enough to attend. Now I was the guest of honor. I stood before the mirror in my penthouse bedroom, adjusting the custom Valentino gown I'd chosen for the occasion. The deep emerald silk perfectly complemented the antique jade necklace that had belonged to my mother, the one piece of her jewelry Victoria had forgotten to hide from me. My phone buzzed with a text from James. Ready to celebrate, the car is waiting. James had grown into his role as CEO beautifully, though he'd insisted I take the title of chairman of the board. Our partnership had evolved from business necessity into genuine friendship, built on mutual respect and shared vision. He was probably the first person in my life who valued me for my mind, rather than what I could provide for them. The award ceremony was held at the St. Regis, the same hotel where Victoria had hosted Melody's debutante ball and made sure I knew I wasn't invited. As I walked the red carpet, cameras flashing and reporters shouting questions, I caught a glimpse of familiar faces in the crowd. Victoria and Melody stood behind the velvet ropes with the other spectators, their faces a mixture of pride, envy, and desperate hope. Victoria had lost weight and aged visibly in the past year, though she was still trying to maintain appearances in a dress that had probably cost more than they could afford. Melody looked hollow-eyed and brittle, her once perfect smile now seeming forced and fragile. My father wasn't with them. I'd heard through industry gossip that he was in rehab, finally facing the addiction issues he'd been hiding behind his business failures for years. Part of me hoped he'd find peace there. Part of me didn't care anymore. Inside the ballroom, I was seated at the head table with tech industry legends and venture capital titans. Richard Chen sat beside me, beaming with grandfatherly pride, as speaker after speaker praised my vision and leadership. "Your mother would be so proud," he whispered during a particularly effusive introduction. "I hope so," I replied, touching the jade necklace. "I think she'd appreciate the justice of it all." When my name was called, I walked to the podium to thunderous applause. The audience was full of people who had either ignored me, underestimated me, or actively worked against me at various points in my journey. Now they were on their feet, celebrating my success. "Thank you," I began, waiting for the applause to die down. 2 years ago, I made what everyone said was the worst investment decision in history. I put my entire inheritance into a failing AI startup run by a college dropout. My family laughed at me. Industry experts called me naive. Financial advisors said I was throwing my money away. Laughter rippled through the audience. They weren't entirely wrong, I continued. I was naive. I believed that innovation and vision mattered more than pedigree and connections. I thought that supporting brilliant people working on world-changing technology was more important than playing it safe with blue-chip stocks. More laughter, warmer this time. But sometimes being naive is exactly what the world needs. Sometimes the people everyone dismisses are the ones with the clearest vision of the future. And sometimes the best revenge against those who underestimate you is simply succeeding beyond their wildest dreams. The applause was deafening. After the ceremony, there was the inevitable parade of people who wanted to network, to reminisce about conversations I didn't remember, to position themselves as having always believed in my potential. I handled them all with gracious professionalism, having learned long ago that success meant everyone wanted to rewrite history to put themselves on the winning side. But as the evening wound down, I found myself on the hotel's rooftop terrace, looking out over the city lights and thinking about the journey that had brought me here. "Quite a night," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to see Marcus Webb approaching hesitantly. He looked different, thinner, more serious, with lines around his eyes that hadn't been there 2 years ago. His tuxedo was well-tailored but not custom, and I noticed his watch was a respectable Omega rather than the Patek Philippe he used to wear. "Marcus," I said neutrally, "I'm surprised to see you here." "My new company got nominated in the emerging tech category," he said. "We didn't win, but making the shortlist felt like a victory." "New company?" "Educational software for underserved communities. We've developed AI-powered tutoring systems that adapt to individual learning styles." He smiled ruefully. "Turns out losing everything was the best thing that ever happened to me. It forced me to figure out what I actually cared about instead of just trying to impress my father." I studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but found only genuine humility. And Melody? His expression grew complicated. Melody and I, we were never really compatible. We were both performing versions of ourselves that we thought the other wanted. When the money pressure went away, we realized we didn't actually like each other very much. "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it. "Are you?" He looked at me curiously. "Because I've had a lot of time to think about what happened that day at Chen Industries. The timing was too perfect. You knew exactly what I was planning, exactly how to counter it. That level of strategic thinking doesn't develop overnight." I met his gaze steadily. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that you're either the luckiest person alive, or you're playing a game the rest of us don't even know exists." He paused. "Either way, I respect it. You saved James from making a terrible mistake, and you probably saved me from becoming the kind of person who destroys other people's dreams for profit. And now? Now I'm trying to build something that actually matters. It's harder than I expected, but more satisfying than anything I did with my family's money. He extended his hand. No hard feelings? I shook it, surprised by the genuine warmth in his grip. No hard feelings. As Marcus walked away, I reflected on the unexpected turns my revenge had taken. I'd set out to destroy the people who had hurt me, but in many cases, I'd simply forced them to confront the truth about themselves. Some, like Marcus, had risen to the challenge. Others, like Victoria and Melody, were still struggling to accept their new reality. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Watching you on the live stream, so proud of everything you've accomplished. Love, Dad. I stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it without responding. Some bridges, once burned, couldn't be rebuilt. But maybe that was okay. Maybe some relationships were meant to end so that new, healthier ones could begin. The elevator dinged behind me and James emerged onto the terrace. There you are, he said. Ready to head home? We've got the board meeting tomorrow and I want to go over the Q3 projections. Always working, I laughed. Don't you ever take time to celebrate? Says the woman who spent her victory party on a conference call with our Tokyo office, he countered. But you're right, tonight deserves celebration. As we rode the elevator down to the lobby, I caught my reflection in the polished steel doors. The woman looking back at me was confident, successful, and genuinely happy. Everything I'd never been in my previous life. James, I said suddenly, do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't invested in Chen Industries? If you'd taken Marcus's offer instead? He considered the question seriously. Honestly, I think I would have regretted it for the rest of my life. Not just financially, but professionally. Marcus wanted to buy the technology, not support the vision. You understood what we were really building. And personally? Personally, I think I'd be working for some corporate overlord, watching other people take credit for my ideas while I collected a salary. He smiled. Instead, I get to work with my best friend on projects that actually change the world. I'd say it worked out pretty well. Best friend. The words hit me with unexpected warmth. In my previous life, I'd been so focused on trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it that I'd never learned to recognize genuine affection when it was freely offered. The lobby was mostly empty now, just a few stragglers from the ceremony making their way to waiting cars and ride shares. As we walked toward the exit, I spotted a familiar figure sitting alone in one of the leather armchairs near the concierge desk. Victoria looked up as we approached, her eyes red-rimmed but determined. She'd clearly been waiting for me. Sophia, she said, rising unsteadily, could I have a word? James glanced at me questioningly. I'll wait in the car, he said diplomatically, giving my arm a reassuring squeeze before heading outside. Victoria and I faced each other across the marble floor, two women who had shared a house for years but had never really known each other at all. You look beautiful tonight, she said quietly. Your mother's necklace suits you. I touched the jade pendant instinctively. You remember it? Of course I remember it. I remember everything about Elena. Victoria's voice cracked slightly. She was everything I wasn't. Elegant, intelligent, genuinely kind. When your father married me, I knew I was a poor substitute, but I thought if I could just be different enough, maybe he'd love me the way he loved her. This wasn't what I'd expected. In all my fantasies of this moment, Victoria had never shown vulnerability, never acknowledged my mother as anything more than an inconvenience. Instead, she continued, I spent years being jealous of a dead woman and taking it out on her daughter. I turned you into a symbol of everything I couldn't be, everything I couldn't give your father. Tears were flowing freely now, smearing her carefully applied makeup. I stole your childhood, Sophia. I stole your relationship with your father. I stole years of happiness from all of us because I was too proud and too scared to admit I needed help. Victoria, let me finish, she said firmly. You owe me nothing, less than nothing after what I put you through. But I need you to know that watching you succeed, seeing the incredible woman you became despite everything I did to tear you down, it's taught me more about strength and grace than I learned in 50 years of trying to fake both. She reached into her purse and pulled out a manila envelope worn and yellowed with age. These are from your grandfather, she said. Birthday cards, Christmas gifts, letters. He never stopped trying to reach you after your mother died. I hid them all because I was terrified that if you had other family who loved you, You'd leave us, and your father would finally see what a mistake he'd made in marrying me. I took the envelope with shaking hands, feeling the weight of decades of lost connection. I know I can't undo the damage, Victoria continued. I know saying sorry doesn't give you back your childhood or repair your relationship with your father. But I needed you to know that your success isn't just your own triumph. It's proof that love and goodness can survive even when people like me try to destroy them. She turned to leave and then paused. For what it's worth, I don't think your mother would want you to waste any more energy on revenge. You've already won in every way that matters. Maybe it's time to focus on building the life she would have wanted for you. With that, she walked away, her heels clicking against the marble until the sound faded into the night traffic outside. I stood alone in the empty lobby, clutching the envelope and trying to process what had just happened. Part of me wanted to dismiss Victoria's words as manipulation, another attempt to guilt me into helping with her financial problems. But the raw honesty in her voice, the complete absence of any request for money or forgiveness, suggested something different. Maybe this was what real accountability looked like. Not the dramatic confrontation I'd imagined, but a quiet acknowledgement of harm done, and a recognition that some damage couldn't be repaired, only accepted. Outside, James was waiting patiently in the back of our hired car, scrolling through his phone. He looked up as I slid in beside him. "Everything okay?" he asked, noticing my expression. "I think so," I said, settling back against the leather seat. "Just closure, I guess." As we drove through the city streets toward my penthouse, I opened the envelope Victoria had given me. Inside were dozens of cards and letters, all addressed to me in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Birthday wishes, Christmas greetings, graduation congratulations for milestones he'd never been allowed to celebrate with me. One letter, dated just after my mother's funeral, made me catch my breath. "My dearest Sophia, I know you're too young to understand why Daddy's family hasn't been part of your life, but I want you to know that I think about you every day. Your mama was my greatest treasure, and you are her greatest gift to the world. I'm including a photograph of her at your age. You look so much like her, not just in appearance, but in the intelligent light in your eyes." She was curious about everything, always asking questions, always dreaming of ways to make the world better. I see that same spirit in you. I hope someday we can meet properly and I can tell you stories about your mama that no one else knows. Until then, know that you are loved more than you can imagine by a grandfather who is proud of you every single day. With all my love, Grandfather Chen. Tears blurred my vision as I read. All those years of feeling like I had no family beyond the people who clearly didn't want me. And there had been someone out there loving me from a distance, waiting for the chance to be part of my life. "Good news?" James asked gently. "The best kind," I said, wiping my eyes. "The kind that makes you realize the story you've been telling yourself isn't the whole truth." The car pulled up outside my building, a gleaming 40-story tower in the heart of the financial district. My penthouse occupied the entire top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city I'd conquered. "Want to come up for a drink?" I asked James as we rode the private elevator to my floor. "I feel like celebrating properly now." "Always," he grinned. "But I'm picking the music this time. Your taste in celebration songs is terrible." My home was a reflection of everything I'd never been allowed to have growing up. Space, beauty, comfort, and most importantly, complete control over my environment. The living room was decorated in warm whites and deep blues, with carefully chosen art pieces and family photographs displayed on floating shelves. The centerpiece was a portrait of my mother that I'd had restored and enlarged, showing her as the vibrant young woman I barely remembered. James headed to the bar while I kicked off my heels and curled up on the sofa, finally allowing myself to fully process the evening's events. 2 years ago, I'd been a bitter young woman consumed with fantasies of revenge. Tonight, I was exactly who I'd always dreamed of becoming: successful, respected, and surrounded by people who valued me for who I truly was. "To Aria," James said, returning with 2 glasses of champagne, "and to the woman brave enough to bet everything on a dream." "To second chances," I countered, raising my glass, "and to the friends who make them worthwhile." We drank, and I felt something settle into place inside me, a sense of completion I'd been chasing my entire life without knowing it. The revenge I'd planned so carefully had morphed into something far more valuable. The realization that the best way to defeat people who diminish you is simply to become too big for their small world to contain. My phone buzzed with notifications, congratulatory messages from industry colleagues, interview requests from major publications, investment opportunities that would have seemed impossible just a few years ago. But for the first time since my rebirth, I felt no urgency to respond immediately. The frantic need to prove myself, to show everyone who had dismissed me how wrong they'd been, had finally quieted. "James," I said suddenly, "what would you think about starting a foundation? Something focused on supporting young entrepreneurs from underprivileged backgrounds?" He looked at me with surprise and delight. "I think that sounds exactly like something the Sophia Chen I know would do. What sparked the idea?" I thought about Marcus Webb's new company, about the educational software he was developing for underserved communities. I thought about Victoria's admission that she'd acted from fear and insecurity rather than malice. I thought about my father, struggling with demons I'd never fully understood, and Melody lost without the artificial identity wealth had provided her. "I spent so much energy being angry about the advantages I didn't have," I said slowly, "that I forgot to appreciate the ones I did. My mother's love, even though it was brief. My grandfather's devotion, even though it was hidden from me. My own intelligence and determination. But mostly, I think I forgot that the point of overcoming obstacles isn't just to prove you can. It's to make sure other people don't have to face the same barriers." James smiled, the expression lighting up his entire face. "You know what? I think your mother would be proud of the woman you've become." "I hope so," I said, fingering the jade necklace. "I really hope so." We spent the rest of the evening planning the foundation, sketching out programs and initiatives that could help other young people achieve their dreams without having to overcome the kind of systematic dismissal I'd faced. It felt like the perfect culmination of everything I'd worked for, not just personal success, but the opportunity to ensure that success could be shared. As James finally prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Sophia, can I ask you something I've always wondered about?" "Of course." "That first day you came to Chen Industries, you seemed so certain that Arya would succeed. More certain than I was, honestly. Where did that confidence come from?" I looked at him, this brilliant, kind man who had become my closest friend and business partner, and felt the weight of the secret I'd carried for 2 years. In my previous life, I died alone, surrounded by the regrets of chances not taken and words not spoken. I'd promised myself that this time would be different. "What would you say," I asked carefully, "if I told you that sometimes people get second chances to fix their mistakes?" James studied my face with the same intensity he brought to debugging complex algorithms. "I'd say that sounds like the premise for either a really good science fiction novel or a really interesting conversation about the nature of consciousness and time. And if it were the conversation, then I'd say that anyone who got that kind of opportunity would be incredibly lucky, and that the universe must have some pretty specific plans for them." He smiled. "I'd also say that I'm grateful to whatever cosmic force decided you deserved another shot at changing the world." I hugged him tightly, overwhelmed by the simple acceptance in his voice. "Thank you for believing in me, even when I couldn't fully explain why I was so sure. Thank you for saving my company and becoming my best friend in the process," he replied. "Now get some sleep. Tomorrow we start changing the world all over again." After he left, I stood at my living room windows, looking out over the city that sparkled with infinite possibility. Somewhere out there, Victoria was probably lying awake, wondering if she'd said too much or too little. Melody was maybe beginning to understand that she needed to build an identity based on something more substantial than other people's money. My father was hopefully taking the first steps toward healing decades of pain and addiction. And Marcus Webb was probably working late in his new office, trying to build something that mattered instead of something that merely impressed. I thought about the letter I'd received from him 6 months ago, a formal apology for his attempted corporate raid, along with a donation to a scholarship fund in my mother's name. He'd written that losing everything had forced him to examine who he really wanted to be versus who he thought he was supposed to be. The experience of failure, he'd said, had taught him more about success than winning ever had. That was the thing about revenge, I realized. The most satisfying kind didn't destroy your enemies. It forced them to confront the truth about themselves. Some, like Marcus, used that confrontation to become better people. Others, like Victoria, finally found the courage to acknowledge their mistakes and try to make amends. And some, like my father and Melody, were still struggling with the process. But that was their journey to make, not mine to control. My journey, this impossible second life I'd been granted, had led me to exactly where I belonged. Not because I'd gotten revenge on people who'd hurt me, but because I'd finally learned to build something bigger than my pain. I walked to my home office and opened my laptop, pulling up the document I'd been working on for the past month. A memoir about overcoming family dysfunction and building success despite systemic dismissal. The working title was Second Chances, a meditation on justice and forgiveness. But looking at it now, I realized the title was wrong. This wasn't really about second chances at all. It was about first chances. The first chance to be truly myself. The first chance to build relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. The first chance to use my success to lift others up rather than prove others wrong. I changed the title to First Chances, Building a Life Worth Living, and began to write Chapter 1. The day I decided to stop being a victim was the day my real life began. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No lightning strikes or orchestral swells. I was standing in a marble foyer, listening to people who had spent years telling me I wasn't good enough celebrate what they thought was my final failure. And suddenly, I realized that their opinion of me had never been about me at all. It had always been about their own fears, their own insecurities, their own inability to see beyond the narrow world they'd constructed for themselves. That realization didn't make me angry anymore. It made me free. I wrote until dawn, pouring out the story of my transformation from bitter victim to successful entrepreneur to, finally, someone who understood that the greatest victory wasn't proving your enemies wrong. It was proving to yourself that you were strong enough to build something beautiful despite them. When the sun rose over the city, painting my white walls with gold and pink light, I saved the document and closed my laptop. In a few hours, James would arrive for our board meeting, full of enthusiasm for the new products we were developing and the foundation we were planning. My grandfather would call with updates about the family business ventures he was teaching me to manage alongside my tech empire. The phone would ring with interview requests and investment opportunities and invitations to events where I'd be celebrated as a visionary leader. But for now, in the quiet of early morning, I simply sat in my beautiful home and felt grateful for the chance to wake up as myself. Not the person others expected me to be, not the person I thought I should be, but exactly who I was meant to become. Outside my windows, the city was beginning to stir with the promise of another day. Somewhere in that maze of buildings and dreams, other young women were probably facing the same dismissal and discouragement I'd once known. Maybe some of them would read my story someday and realize that the people who try to make you small are usually just afraid of how big you might become. Maybe they'd learn what it took me 2 lifetimes to understand, that the best revenge against people who don't believe in you is simply becoming too successful for their disbelief to matter. And maybe, like me, they'd discover that success tastes sweetest when it's seasoned, not with bitterness, but with the simple joy of finally becoming who you were always meant to be. I smiled, touching my mother's jade necklace one more time, and began preparing for another day of building the life she would have wanted for me. A life filled with purpose, surrounded by love, and dedicated to making sure that other people's daughters never had to fight as hard as I did to prove they deserved to dream. The revenge was complete. The real life was just beginning.